So you want to lift your Jeep Wrangler, but you don't want it to ride like crap and you're not sure which suspension to get. That's what this video is for. I'm not trying to sell you on any particular suspension kit, but I want to go into some of the most common questions I get when people are looking to either A, upgrade their factory suspension, or B, have bought a Jeep with an aftermarket suspension and are not happy with the ride. So let's dive into that. Now, number one, this video is going to be focused on the TJ, JK, and JL platform. So that's 1997 to current. Why? Well, those are all multi-link Wranglers, and pretty much everything I'm going to talk about here can cover the bases there. First off, let's talk about the cheapest suspension that you can get for your vehicle, and that's a budget boost. What's a budget boost? Typically, it's just a spacer that sits on top of the coil spring, and that's just going to lift the vehicle. The advantage of a coil spacer, a budget boost, is that if you like how your Jeep rides from the factory, you like that spring rate, you're happy with the shock valving, and all you're trying to do is make it taller, spacer lift is going to be perfectly fine for that. However, if you are going to be a little bit more serious about going off-road and you want that suspension performance to be increased, that's when you need to start looking at lift kits that have aftermarket coils, shocks, and a few more accessories. And let's talk about coils first. Most suspension manufacturers do not list their coil rates online. I wish more did, because it would really give you a good indicator of how that vehicle is going to ride. Now, that is because the spring rate can vary wildly from manufacturer to manufacturer, and that information is only but so good if you can compare it to what the spring rate is from the factory. And that's a hard one too, because on the JL platform especially, it changes from Wrangler to Wrangler. If you have a 392 Wrangler, it's much stiffer. If you've got a 4xe, it's different coils in the rear. There's just a lot of different spring rates from the factory that would make it difficult to get a good baseline of, okay, this is gonna ride this way, or this is actually gonna give me this much lift height. So let's talk a little bit about what to look for and the differences. You'll hear a lot of suspension manufacturers say that they've got a linear rate coil, or they'll push you and say, oh, we've got this multi-rate coil, which is so much better. A linear rate is exactly how it sounds. It's just one rate from top to bottom. And typically on a taller coil spring, there's an advantage to that as you get less bow out of the spring. That's been my experience. The advantage of going with a multi-rate spring, where you have that really tight wind at the top and then it allows the suspension to drop out a little bit, is you can sometimes get a little bit of a softer package coil spring like that. Now, a lot of times these multi-rate springs really are just, it's kind of like having a tender spring up top. And what a tender spring is a spring that doesn't do anything while you're driving down the road other than being completely collapsed. And as the suspension articulates, it drops out. This coil wind just drops out. And what it does is it keeps the coil kind of in place. So those are your linear versus multi-rate springs. I don't think you should get too caught up in it. Sometimes what happens is suspension manufacturers just assume that if you're lifting your Jeep, you want it nose high or you want it level. And so their 2.5 spring is a heavier rate, or it's a little bit taller. And while other manufacturers may say, well, we're just going for ride quality, we want the softest spring that we can get, and it's going to keep that factory rake where it's a little higher in the back. And those are some of the differences that you got to work through. There's no magic ball to be like, oh, this one's going to ride like this and this is going to be easy. You have to do your research. You have to call these suspension manufacturers and say, hey, listen, I don't have a lot of extra weight on my Jeep, or hey, I've got a ton of extra weight. I've got bumpers and skid plates and I plan on putting a rooftop tent on. And then they might say, hey, well, we have a standard rate spring and we have a heavy duty spring. That's where those things matter, is when you're adding the extra weight, because if you have a spring that's too light and you add a rooftop tent on, it's going to make it drive all over the place, because all the spring is really designed to do is lift the vehicle, support that specific height that you need. What's controlling that sort of movement going down the road are the shock. If you have too little valving, the truck's gonna ride like this all the time. It's gonna feel like it's all over the place. If you have too much valving, it's gonna be super harsh. You're gonna get a lot of feedback in the vehicle. and it's just going to drive you crazy for daily driving. That stiff rate might be great for off-roading and going really fast because it'll control that compression as you're taking those big hits, but for daily driving, it might suck. So the biggest recommendation I tell people is, if you're going to go with that particular company's coil, just go with their shock. If they have insert shock here and it says their spec, because at least you know they have taken the time to get not only the valving right for that coil, but a lot of times, especially on the higher end shocks, the bodies are different. And this is something that not a lot of people probably pay attention to, but you know, you get companies that actually not only change the valving, but they have different landing feet for how the shock mounts at the axle, and they've got different length bodies that give them the ability to get a little bit more up travel, or maybe a little bit more down travel out of the shock, or let the shock, let's say if it's a bypass, ride in a different zone so it'll ride a little bit better. It's those things that I think are not necessarily like talked about enough that really make a difference when you're buying an aftermarket suspension kit and you're getting that coil and that shock. Not all companies spend the time to do all of this, and you've got to manage your expectations on what you're going to get out of a $300 suspension kit versus a $3,000 suspension kit, and it can go up to $13,000, $18,000. These suspension kits get nuts. The idea here is it's worth spending a little bit more money on a suspension manufacturer that does actually put their time into having a spec shock for their coil. It's going to make a difference. So that is something to consider when you're looking at buying. In terms of compression adjusters, you'll see that's a big option these days and super popular for a lot of aftermarket shocks. My experience has been they actually work. They're not snake oil. Are they worth it? They're only worth it if you are willing to spend the time to fine tune and adjust it. For a lot of people, that's just not something they either know what to look for or even want to mess with. So if you're that person, then yeah, maybe that's not the shock you want to go with. And the recommendation I would say is just circle back to making sure that whatever suspension manufacturer you got, or you're going to go with, get the right shock that is engineered for that kit, and I think you'll be happy with that. So that's just my 2 cents on that. Now let's move away from the conventional coil and shock, and let's jump into coil over, because it's another question I always get a lot about. Why not just go coil over? Why are they so expensive? What's the advantages? There's 2 main advantages of going with a coilover. Number one, it allows the suspension to travel further because you're outside of the limitations of what a typical coil can do. So this isn't as dramatic oftentimes as it's played out to be, because there are still going to be limitations with your steering and your drive shafts that are only going to allow you that suspension to travel but so much. So what you're really talking about is moving to a coilover might get you another 3 inches of down travel. It can be up to like maybe 5 or 6 depending on what coil and shock you're moving from, but it's a travel play, and which is really helpful when you're talking about not only keeping the tire on the ground, because the tire on the ground is one that can fight for traction, so getting all that big articulation out, coilover is a great option for that. But the overlooked advantage of a coilover, in my opinion, is the fact that a coilover can be built to your specific vehicle and your ride needs. Now, ride quality is very subjective, and I will tell you, I've had a lot of Jeeps on coilovers and I've had them on coils and shocks, and I will tell you the big advantage of a coilover is that you have a primary and a secondary rate typically. So you have 2 different coil springs in general on most coilovers. The primary, it's the reason it's called that is your primary rate that the vehicle is riding on. So when you're going down the road, that is the spring that you really, it's supporting the vehicle, but it's also taking up all those imperfections in the road. That's the spring rate you're riding on. And the nice thing about a coilover is you have that small coil that you can actually make that rate really light, whereas it'd be very difficult to do that with a progressive or linear rate spring. It doesn't matter. You can package that much easier, so you can have the super light coil spring on top of that coilover, on top of your secondary, so going down the road it can just be smooth as butter, and you don't have to have an overly stiff coil to worry, because what's going to happen is when you go off-road and you're ready to start driving hard, you've got this second coil spring that's going to sit, and when it takes that big hit and starts to travel up, it's going to hit a stop collar, and that's something that you can adjust for when it actually engages. And when it does, it kicks in that higher spring rate at the bottom, and that's what's going to slow down that shock even more and give you that additional rate you need. So now you've got something that rides really nice on the highway and can take those big hits off-road. That to me is why when people say, hey, like I want to buy once, cry once, and buy a really nice kit, is a coilover worth it? I explained to them, this is why I think it might be worth it for you, because not only can you adjust if one corner of your Jeep is a little heavier because you've got your, I don't know, ARB cooler or something in the back, you can adjust that collar down to get it level where it's more difficult with a coil, trying to put a coil spacer and that type of thing. But you can also change those spring rates out really easily. So if you decide one day, I want to be a hardcore overland guy and I want to deck my Jeep out to go to Alaska and back and have all my stuff with me, you can swap those rates out to heavier rates that can handle that, and you still get all of that sweet suspension performance and long travelability, and your Jeep's going to drive great. So yes, there's a reason why coilovers are more expensive. Yes, there's a reason why there's a genuine advantage of going with a coilover. Coil shock, that's what's going to really determine a lot of your ride quality and how it feels. The other thing that you'll see when you're looking at a suspension kit is whether it comes with a aftermarket control arm, and is that arm adjustable, and what type of joint. These things matter. Quite simply, not to get too long-winded, the control arm bushing that they come on from the factory is just rubber. So your TJ, JK, JL just has a factory rubber bushing. Great for vibration absorption, no maintenance required. Works okay off-road, but that's really the limit, is when you're trying to get more articulation and let the suspension travel a lot, that's going to be sort of the wall at which you reach, oh well, this is where that joint's not great. If you want to get more off-road performance, you want to go with something that's not a factory style rubber bushing, understanding that you're going to trade off a little bit more of vibration absorption. So let's say you go to a higher end, something like a Rock Jock Johnny joint. That joint offers way more degree deflection, and that's going to equate to a smoother ride off-road because the suspension can just move freely underneath the vehicle, whereas the bushing is going to transmit that into the cab, and you're going to feel that push back one way or the other. There are companies that kind of go in the middle of that, so if you don't want something that is serviceable and you got to grease and all that stuff like a Johnny joint, and you need something more than your factory style rubber bushing, there are joints like the Rock Crawler Adventure series that has the ability to give you very similar degree deflection as a flex style joint, in some cases more, but it's still a rubber bushing that doesn't require maintenance. The only bushing I'll tell you to stay away from, I recommend, if it says it's just a polyurethane, don't use that. They squeak, they don't give you a lot of flex, and you don't get the advantage of the vibration absorption. I don't like polyurethane replacement joints. I just don't think they work very well for an off-road Jeep related suspension. That's the only one I would say avoid. Now, in terms of the control arms and adjustability and fix, adjustability, quite simply, is going to be better. If you can afford it, go ahead and click the box for the adjustable control arm. It's going to allow you to reposition the axle properly. It's also going to give you the ability to, when you take it to the alignment shop, they can get your caster right, so you can get positive caster. It's going to make the Jeep drive better, and it gives you the ability to grow with the suspension. A fixed arm is really good if you're just going to set and forget. You're not going to go, you're not going to be Mr. Crazy Rock Crawler guy. You don't want to have to figure out how to adjust the arms and all that stuff. A fixed arm is typically just going to be a suspension with a set of lowers, and they're usually about a ½ inch longer. So it gives you a little bit more caster and helps center the tire and the wheel well a little bit more. Nothing wrong with that. I've got Jeeps with fixed aftermarket lower control arms on it. It's fine. It's just more of a that's more of a street-oriented arm that you're not going to be fine-tuning over the adjustable. If you have the choice between the two, go adjustable. That's really the two main things to note. The last thing to touch on with control arms is TJ specific, 97 to 06. Once you get it past about 3 inches of lift, you're better off going with a longer control arm, and it's a bigger investment, but the arms are just super short. On the JK and JL platforms, you can really get away with keeping that factory control arm because they're really long, and you can, the factory mounts at least. And if you want it to drive a little bit better, let's say you're going to go with a 3.5 inch lift or maybe a 4.5 inch lift, you can do geometry correction brackets. And what that does is in the front, they bolt in the spot of the factory control arm mounts, and that's going to just lower the control arms down a bit so the arms aren't at such an angle, which the more you have of an angle, the harsher it is and harder for that suspension to really work, not only well on road, but when you get off-road and you have a really steep angle, when you go to encounter an obstacle, it's going to make the Jeep actually want to push the axle under this way and lift, versus if it's at a more neutral angle as you go off-road and you hit an obstacle, the axle is going to want to go up and over. So that's really why you don't want a big extreme angle with the arm. I've talked a lot about this in the past. Depending on your tire and wheel package, that can factor into what control arm is best for your vehicle. Going with a high numerical back spacing means the wheel is going to tuck under the vehicle more, and when you do that with a larger than stock tire, the challenge is the tire may hit the control arm. So if it doesn't have a bend in it, you are more likely going to hit. That's really a simple way. So if you're looking at the control arm on the manufacturer's website and it looks like it's got a big relief, kind of like the factory does on the JK and the JL, then you know, okay, I can get away with maybe even my stock wheel and a little bit taller tire. But if it's a straight arm, like, Rock Crawler does more or less a straight arm, it's just bent for more like ground clearance, then you might hit it. And that's why it's super important when you're looking at an aftermarket suspension kit and you haven't purchased your wheels yet, or if you're wondering, hey, can I keep my stock wheels and maybe just run a wheel spacer? Look on that information site, on that manufacturer's website, and they'll tell you, hey, we recommend this lift height with this tire with this much back spacing. And that's going to give you a great indicator of, oh, well, that wheel I'm looking at is not going to work because it's going to, stay under the fender a little bit more. There is an advantage to going with higher numerical back spacing for sure. It's going to make the steering a little bit easier, less scrub radius, but sometimes, especially as you get to that 37 and 38 inch tall tire range and the tires get wider, you have to start getting that wheel pushed away from the vehicle. Just remember, low back spacing number, so 3 inches means the tire gets pushed away from the vehicle. High back spacing number means the tire is more tucked under the fender. So that's something to consider. The other thing I want to talk about, and it's another very important thing when you're looking at aftermarket suspension, are track bars and track bar brackets. So most aftermarket suspensions above usually like 2.5 inches will come with at least an adjustable front track bar. That's going to get the axle re-centered. Absolutely, you want to look for a kit that has that. It's worth it. You don't want the axle sitting out. Not only is that going to be bad for tracking, obviously it's going to look weird, but what it'll do, especially if you have rubber bushings, it's going to put them at a weird bind where they're constantly kind of, offset. So you want to make sure that the vehicle is tracked correctly up front. And you'll notice a lot of aftermarket suspension kits do not have adjustable track bars in the rear standard. They'll just give you a bracket, and what that bracket is designed to do is raise the factory track bar. The advantage of raising the rear track bar is that it increases the roll center. That might sound bad, but that's actually a good thing. You want that track bar to be as high and flat as possible. It's going to give it the best roll center so it doesn't feel like it's going to sway as much. It's really good for suspension geometry. You want track bars up and flat. That is just a good rule of thumb. Other things that you'll see that are good items that come with higher end kits that a lot of times don't come with entry level kits and drives me crazy are bump stop spacers. Now what bump stop spacers are simply you're spacing up the amount of bump you have, so it usually bolts at the axle, and what you're trying to do is make sure that when you're putting on a larger tire, you need to make sure you stop that suspension at a certain point. If not, you're going to damage your fender, and most people want to keep their fenders intact, so you need bump stop spacers to allow you to do that. Now there are a lot of different spacer types out there. It doesn't really matter if they're multi-piece or if they're single, they're going to come with that particular kit. I do like stackable spacers because you can fine tune the suspension up travel a little bit better that way. So, you know, sometimes suspension manufacturers will just give you kind of a one size fits all. Hey, here's a 2-inch spacer, and you might not go with that maximum tire size. Let's say you went with a 35 and not a 37. Well, now you're sacrificing an inch of up travel. You could just do a 1-inch spacer and get a little bit more up travel. And up travel is great. That's really where you're going to get a lot of performance out of your suspension and that terrain absorption. So stackable bump stops I'm a fan of, but don't be afraid to play and cycle your suspension when you get it to see, oh man, I got a lot of shock shaft showing here. I could get a little bit more up travel. But a lot of that, the reason that suspensions get bumped the way they do is because they're trying to prevent your tire from messing up your flare. If you're going with an aftermarket flare, or you don't mind splitting the flare like you have a Rubicon, then you can absolutely adjust that bump stop spacer. So if you got questions, or if you're looking at one particular lift kit or anything like that, like drop them in the comments. If you want to hit me up directly and ask a question, you can find me on all social media at Ollie Mansour Editor, and I'm happy to help you out the best I can. I do think there are more good suspensions on the market these days than there are really crappy ones. So it's really hard to get a bad one, but it's easy to pick a suspension that might not be the best for your needs if you don't do the research. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, don't forget to like the video, consider subscribing to the Driving Line channel. We definitely have more Jeep oriented and off-road oriented content coming, and there's plenty years worth on this channel you can find as well. So I appreciate you guys making it to the end, and as always, thanks for watching, and hope to see you on the trail. Take care.